صباح الخير أو مساء الخير أو يعني الساعة 3 الخير. Today we are privileged to have a friend and a colleague and a scholar, Dr. Daniel Newman from the Honor Frost Foundation. The topic Danny has been working on and specialized in and will present is something that is not very common or familiar to our communities. Normally, as researchers and archaeologists, we tend to talk to each other. Conferences, seminars, workshops, they would be attended by archaeologists talking to archaeologists, and that's it. So it's a closed circle. And this closed circle is not very effective, actually, because we have to get out of this circle and talk to the public, because the public are the ones who find the sites and preserve the sites. Archaeologists are in minority compared to the general public. So this is the whole idea, basically. How can you convince someone that maritime archaeology is important, that an archaeological site is essential to be preserved? How can you convince someone who has nothing to do with heritage or archaeologists, someone in the street, an employee in a company or someone in a shop or a school teacher? So basically this what has been the focus of Danny's research. Applying this to our community is even more difficult because of the difficulty in culture, difficulty in language, difference in education system. So there's quite a lot of differences between applying these ideas and methodologies in the West and in our region. And again, this is what we are trying to work together on. Danny and our colleagues at the center and the library as well, trying to figure out how we can apply this to our region. Generally speaking, maritime research or maritime archaeology in the Arab region is quite recent, if I may say. Although it has started decades ago, but the actual research is only maybe 20 or 30 years old. And involving the public in this is even more recent, more young. We still, in many countries, including Egypt, we still don't have maritime museums. In many countries, we still don't have documentaries about maritime archaeology in Arabic. We're relying on, documentaries produced by Western channels. This sort of thing. So, in fact, Daniel is discussing something that is quite new to us. Danny is here for a week. She has been teaching at the center, and she has been giving workshops, and now she's giving this lecture. So we're using her, we are utilizing her. We are actually exploiting her, if I may say, to the best possible way. And without further, I would like to welcome Danny Newman to the Biblioteca Alexandrina, and thank her very much for coming. The stage is all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ahmad, for that wonderful welcome, and thank you all for braving the Lego crowd next door to come to my lecture today. We will start at the beginning, as we always do with these things. So as the introduction said, my name is Dr. Danny Newman, and I'm a Maritime Archaeology Manager for the Honor Frost Foundation. So hello.
Hello.
It is really nice to meet you all. As you can probably tell from my accent, it's a bit of an odd one. I'm Canadian by birth, I'm British by work. So I've lived in the UK and worked in the UK for the last 20 years. I have a PhD in archaeology from the University of Southampton. And while I was there, I was lucky enough to work on the Black Sea Maritime Archaeology Project as the education officer. And this is one of the case studies that I'll be talking about towards the end of the lecture. Then after that, I moved to a very different project, and I was a community archaeologist for the Coastal and Intertidal Zone Archaeology Network, which worked around England with communities to help them monitor the heritage that was coming out of the eroding sea. And then after that, finally, I moved to the Honor Frost Foundation, where I'm responsible for grants, engagement, training, social media, and conferences. And also, delightfully, apparently traveling to Alexandria and getting to speak to all of you today. So I thought it wouldn't be fair for me not to start without talking a little bit about my employers. So the Honor Frost Foundation was established in 2011 after the death of Honor Frost. And Honor Frost, as you can see from the bottom image, which features her sitting, what I think might be a familiar sight for some people. This is her along the harbour of Alexandria in 1995 when the Pharos stones were being raised. Honor Frost was an amazing maritime archaeologist who worked throughout the region. She was a real trailblazer, and she was a woman who's inspired many of us to be and work in this field. When she died, she left a very valuable collection of paintings and her estate to establish a foundation to promote the advancement in research, including publication of maritime archaeology, with a particular focus on the Eastern Mediterranean, specifically Lebanon, Syria, Cyprus, and Egypt. And so what is it we do? We increase capacity within the region. We fund projects, fund research, we fund students, fund training, and we fund engagement. And we also work to develop the discipline broadly. So we have a steering committee on underwater cultural heritage, and next month, with our fingers crossed, we'll be hosting a policy forum here in Alexandria to bring together industry and archaeology to talk about how we can work together to preserve our coastlines and our maritime heritage. And although he's not here, I would be remiss not to mention our new Honor Frost Foundation liaison officer, Dr. Ziad Morsi, who is here for you to exploit. Once you stop exploiting me and I leave, he is here for you to use. So if you have any questions about how to work with the Honor Frost Foundation, how to apply for our grant, or maybe you're interested in studying underwater cultural heritage, he's the person for you to talk to. Now please ask your questions. And your English is better than my Arabic, so please do not be worried. I hope that we will be able to have a lovely discussion today after this presentation, where I can understand a bit more about any of the problems that you might see in how this work could work within Egypt. So, what is maritime cultural heritage? It's a very good question. Oh, what have I done here? So what is maritime cultural heritage? Maritime cultural heritage is both the tangible and intangible connections that we have to all forms of water. So it's not just what is in the ocean, it's in our coastline, and it's what's in our memories of our maritime past. So it's how we experienced water in the past, how we used it, how it helped us, and how it helped us create connections throughout history between different people and different places. So we're talking about harbors, we're talking about lighthouses, we're talking about shipwrecks, of course, but we're also talking about the sites that we find in the muds along our shorelines, and the sites that we find inland, such as storehouses and places where maritime heritage would have been built, and where the materials to come from would have been used. And what makes this environment unique? Well, this is based on work done by a wonderful man named Anthony Firth for the Honor Frost Foundation, and he stressed 4 different ways that maritime heritage is unique. So visibility, and this is the main one, with public engagement, with working with communities, with getting people to understand why a shipwreck might be important. This is one of the main ways this is unique, and is the idea of out of sight, out of mind. So when you're taking a tourist around, a friend who has come to visit your city, and you show them the citadel. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. It's there. It's very present. It is a thing that they can look at, they can see. But when you tell them that there was one of the 7 wonders of the world that it was built on, where there are remains still in the bay there, it's not as important to them. Because for them, it is not as real a thing as what we have in front of us. Accessibility. So many of the sites that you're probably thinking of in your mind have problems with accessibility. They're only ones that divers can visit. Mobility. This one is actually very much positive. So again, if you think of a shipwreck, vessels could have had many connections with different places and people throughout times. They moved. So a ship could be built in one place, and then it could take on cargo in a place, then it could be fixed in another place, and then finally reach its destination. So this makes it a very interesting and a very unique thing throughout history. And really then it also has connections to the then, so when the ship was built, and the now, when it is discovered. And mutability is really the idea that the maritime world is different than the terrestrial world. So there are no paths to an underwater site. When you're underwater, you operate in a 360-degree world around you, and you're able to move differently through these spaces. And that's a difficult concept for some people to understand, that it's not just forwards, backwards, left and right, it's everything all around you. So how do we get people to engage? What are we aiming for? So this graphic was made in, I believe, about 2015. And it's one of my favorite ways of explaining the importance of engagement and what we're trying to do. And what we're really working on when we communicate with the public is this heritage cycle. And it's the idea that by understanding it, people will value it. By valuing it, they will want to care for it. And by caring for it, they will enjoy it. And from enjoying it comes a thirst for knowledge. And what I like about this is that there is no one point that a person can enter this cycle. There's no one way that a person can really start enjoying and connecting with their heritage. There are many ways, but they will feed into each other, and gradually a person will become able to enjoy the heritage more and to appreciate and to value it more. So tell me a story, take me on an adventure. Now, we all remember stories from our childhood, yes? And this is one of the things that I really want people to understand, is that when we're doing public engagement, when we're communicating with the public, what we are really doing and what we really want to do is to tell them a story that will excite them, that will fascinate them, and that will make them connect with whatever story we're trying to tell, the object, the thing, the place that we want to have. And there are several ways that we can do this. And perhaps the most important way is to include ourselves as archaeologists within this story. People love methods. People love to know how and why we do what we do. And I think it's very easy for us as archaeologists to forget that we are part of the narrative of what we're excavating and what we're talking about throughout heritage. And it's important that we use ourselves to communicate with people, because ultimately we became archaeologists because we love telling the stories of the past through objects. We like history because we like people. And it's important that we make sure that the public is aware that we are still one of them. We are not separate. We are just a person who has studied a bit more about one subject. Now, how do we do this? This is a complicated thing sometimes, but sometimes it can be very simple. And one of my favorite ways of telling a story is by finding what I call the hook. And this is normally the public idea of an object. So my favorite comparison for this is I have a coin in my hand, and I'm showing it to the public, and they say, it's treasure. Now, I hear laughter because all of us are going, no, I'm not a treasure hunter. This is not what I do. I don't deal with treasure. I deal with historical facts. I deal with tangible objects, and this is so much more valuable than treasure, than just the weight of it if you melted it down. But the hook, and using the hook, is essentially saying to them, yes, it is treasure, but not for the reasons that you think. It's treasure because of the faces on both sides. It's treasure because of the date. It's treasure because of the science that I can use to tell where it was made, to tell about the voyage and the story of where it went. So how do we tell these stories? What else can we use? Well, we can use the 5 senses. So these are the most basic things that as a child and as adults we use every day. But you think of a small child sat on the floor, and beside the child it has all of its favorite toys. And what does the child do? It reaches out to grab its most favorite toy. And then, of course, it tries to eat it. It smells it. It sees if it makes a noise. These are all things that even as adults, we still do to a certain level. So I encourage people, when they're thinking about engagement, to think about all of the senses that we have, to not just think of the visual or the verbal, but to think of all the things that we do and did as children to learn. And this feeds into learning styles, which is a very popular way to think about how to design engagement and education programming. So this is the idea that certain people learn better in certain ways. So you have the visual learners, the oral learners, the verbal learners, the kinesthetic learners. What's really interesting, though, is that recent studies have shown that actually people don't learn better in one way or another, but they think they do. And because people think they do, it's important that we offer all of these different ways that people can absorb the material that we are putting out, and the material and take-home messages that we want them to have when they come and speak to us. And then I've said the word several times, but I will say it again, connections. So we are looking at and talking about personal connections, emotional connections, and physical connections. And what I mean about personal connections is these are connections that people can make with an object that are unique to them. So this is seeing something from your something that reminds you of a moment from your childhood. This is a very personal connection that you will have. Emotional connections tend to be larger scale, more social connections to an event in life. So memories of a war, memories of a natural event, memories of a larger social group event, such as attending a game or attending a rock concert or something like that. These are emotional connections. And physical connections are the simple connections of holding something in your hand. So again, if we think back to one of the problems and one of the things that makes maritime archaeology and maritime underwater cultural heritage unique, and what we're really talking about there is removing the obstacle of out of sight, out of mind. So if you can give somebody something physical that they can hold, that they can touch, relating to a submerged site, it becomes more real to them. And so what are the outcomes? What are we looking for when we talk about engagement? One of the things we're looking to develop is ownership. And I'm not saying private ownership, and I'm not saying people physically owning, but what I'm talking about is the cultural ownership that people can have of heritage sites. So this is the idea that people will value and care for what is around them because they enjoy and they appreciate it. So it's making a cultural site not just belonging to academia, to the archaeologists, to the government, to the policymakers. It's making the sites part of the story of the people there, part of their story as a unique individual. And one of the ways that we do this is through engagement with multiple narratives on a site. So this is the idea of engaging with the different interpretations that we have, that a group will have and individuals will have of a site. So with this one, obviously, as archaeologists, we have our evidence and our narrative that we have of a site based on the science and the interpretations that we have. But in my mind, there is very little problem with presenting this with presenting this on its own. And it's important that we present what other communities, what the local communities believe the interpretation of the site is. Because again, that is a hook, and that is saying that we have made our best guess. Because ultimately, a lot of archaeology is our best guess, and we have to be open, and we always are open to a change in interpretation when new technology comes around, when we're able to do more science for any sites that we have. And so I think this engagement with multiple narratives of a site, it really is a strength that we can have through engagement. It's hearing other people's stories about it. It's hearing about the development of a site through history. So one of my favorites is there's a Roman amphitheater that I've done a bit of work on that in the early 1980s became one of the best skateboard parks in the area. And that's a modern narrative, but that's part of the story of the site. And it's important, particularly now that the people who skateboarded there are in their 40s and 50s. They're bringing their children to the site. And they want to be able to tell their story of how they used the site before the government came and restored it. And really, another outcome of all of this, and also of using the local knowledge, which is really just appreciating that the locals will know where the heritage is. I'm talking about the elderly people, the sponge fishermen, the fishermen, and the children that still go explore. They know where the local heritage is. And if you've given them ownership of a site and engaged with their narrative of it, then they will be more likely to trust you, and they'll be more likely to share future sites with you. And what doing all of this allows us really to do is to develop a heritage plan for a site that fits with the aims of everybody involved. So when I talk to stakeholders, I talk about the public, I talk about politicians and funders, and I talk about the archaeologists, the professionals, but I also talk about the heritage. So it's important to remember that we always speak for the heritage as archaeologists, and we are the people moving forward who really appreciate what it is that the heritage can bring. And so it's important that we always remember that it must be one of many priorities that we have. And one of the other things that engagement does is it creates science capital and builds capacity. So science capital is it's essentially the cards you are holding in a card game. And it's understanding the rules of that card game. So when you first start playing cards, when I first started playing cards with my grandmother years ago, she knew the game much better than I did, and she won all the time. But then I got older, and I got better because I played, and I learned her tricks. I learned her tells. I learned how she managed to win. And that built my capacity. That built my knowledge. And it's the same with engagement with maritime cultural heritage. The more people have of it, the more their capital, their knowledge capital grows, and the more capacity they have to learn about it. So how can we help people value heritage? So traditionally, heritage managers and archaeologists have controlled access to sites. We're talking about physical, intellectual, commercial, and academic access. But now, really the trend in heritage engagement is for facilitation. And now I know that this is something that is going to be a bit of a difficult one, but there are many ways to facilitate access to a site. And I'm not necessarily speaking about allowing people to go and excavate on your sites, but what I'm speaking of is working with communities and working with the publics at every step of the process so that they are able to understand and to help you interpret what you're finding. So we think back to the local knowledge that we had and everything that it can bring in. This is what I'm talking about, is that as archaeologists, we have the skills to excavate, but we do not have the local context. And so it's important for us to value the contributions that the local stakeholders can make. So what are the values? What is the value of maritime cultural heritage? So David Lowenthal, who's a fantastic writer on this subject, wrote The Past is a Foreign Country in 1985, and he suggested 6 ways that the past benefits societies. And the first ways are familiarity and recognition. So the past allows us to looking at the past allows us to contextualize the present. So it allows us to see how we have gone from one place to another and how we have ended up at this moment in time. Reaffirmation and validation, again, that's looking at how our really it helps cement our place in time and our place within the wider community. This in turn helps create an individual and group identity, and the heritage provides guidance, enrichment, and escape from the world around us. And museums are also increasingly seen as social spaces. So although it costs, I believe, 5 Egyptian pounds for a person to come in to Biblioteca, yeah. That's not a huge amount, thankfully, but museums are wonderful, safe, equitable, and non-market places, and that makes them very unique in the world and in cultures. So if I go into a shop, I'm expected to buy something, whereas here I pay my 5, I come in, and all of this is mine to explore, and it is a place where I can be reasonably assured that I will be safe and I will be made welcome, regardless of who I am in the world. And what's really interesting about museums is that people believe they are a benefit even if they don't attend them. They like knowing that they're there. They like knowing that there is somebody who is taking care of the past, and they like knowing that it will be there if they do want to go and see it. And so people have a positive attachment to these spaces. Now, how does heritage become valuable to the individual? Well, here we talk about the concept of well-being, which is essentially how happy people are. So increased well-being equals better health and better connections to society. And there's a great deal of research going on right now into how heritage can contribute to a person's well-being. So we're talking about heritage as a process. So the act of digging, the act of physically connecting to the heritage and to the project that you are working on. Heritage as participation, again, to be able to go out, to work within a larger group. Heritage as healing. So there are several projects in the United Kingdom where people are bringing bits of heritage into prisons, into hospitals, into mental institutions, where people are unable to go and visit the sites, and they have noted marked improvements in the well-being of these people. Heritage as place. So what makes Alexandria Alexandria? I think part of it is the heritage. You know, part of it is what's in the bones of the city. Heritage as environment. Going outside makes you happier. Everybody's mother has told them this. Go outside, you'll be happier. Yes. And heritage as a mechanism. So heritage as a way of thinking about all of these things together, and as a process that we go through. So what even am I talking about? I know I've been talking for about half an hour now, and now I thought it would be really good to start thinking about really how we categorize engagement and how we think about it. So most of you have probably heard of the term outreach or public archaeology, or an education program in a museum. So these were the terms that existed when I started my PhD many years ago. And I decided to come up with a new way of thinking about engagement, which was really a more public-focused way. So rather than looking at what we were doing, are we going and doing outreach? Are we running an education program? I decided to group things as either passive or active, depending on the amount of effort that a person had to do to participate in the program I was offering. And I also added museums in their own little bubble, because museums are always special, but because museums are active and they are passive, depending on the work that they're doing. And so I'm just going to show you two museums, because they are a very unique spaces. So we are going to start in China, and hopefully the video will work. But if not, I have two beautiful photos there for you to look at. So the Maritime Silk Route Museum in Hailing Island, China, was built to house the archaeological remains of a shipwreck called the Nanhai One, which comes from the 10th century. And it was a trading ship that has about 80,000... No. Yeah, I do have flash memory.
1 second. We try to handle it.
It should be embedded. Is there internet access for this?
We have internet access.
This is good, I can have some water.
مش عندناش الفايل، مش حاطاه.
That doesn't matter.
مش موجود اساسا.
It should be.
It's just an image, it's not video.
Okay, fine. Don't worry. Do not worry.
No, it's
Go back. There we go. Alas, no videos. But it's still an amazing museum. And as I said, it was built to house the shipwreck of the Nanhai One. And the way they decided to display this shipwreck and to excavate is they went out with essentially a big cookie cutter, you know? They put it down into the seafloor, to the sediment, and blocked it all off and raised it as a single block. Then they put this block in the middle of the museum, in the beautiful new museum, and they slowly started lowering the salt water around it. So you see at the top image right here, good. You see at the top image right here, this is the shipwreck in its saltwater tank. And then down here, this is them as they're lowering the water, allowing archaeologists to essentially work on an intertidal site. And you can see around, there are viewing galleries for the public. So at this point, the public was able to come and see the process of excavating a shipwreck, which is something that we've said is, you know, a very difficult environment for people to normally get into. And the second museum I want to talk about is Baia Underwater Archaeological Site, which is in Italy and takes a very different approach. So on this wonderful submerged site, which is a sunken city, divers go out with an archaeologist on a boat. There's 8 dives per day allowed on the sites. The archaeologist helps interpret what is being said and what the people are going to see. And then the divers go down now with an augmented reality iPad. So they are able to look at the various ruins, look at the various statues, and they come to life for them. The divers then surface. The archaeologist is there to answer any questions. And the money that is raised from these dives goes in to fund further research on the site itself. So we have two wonderful ways of looking at it. You bring the site to the people, you bring the people to the site. So now we'll talk a little bit about what I call passive engagement. And with when I say passive engagement, what I mean is engagement by stealth. So people wake up in the morning and they do not necessarily think they are going to be engaging with underwater cultural heritage or maritime cultural heritage on that day. And the majority of these are ways that people can either engage in their own time, at their own leisure, or they're ways that will pop up unexpectedly in people's lives at various other events through them. So we're talking about the mainstream media, about social media, about online content, particularly now online tours and online museums, 3D representations of sites. We're talking about the use of technology, again, things like the augmented reality, things like even a QR code that people can scan using their own phones that provides them additional information. Festivals. Festivals are one of my favorite ways to talk to the public, because if you set up your archaeological stand at a festival that no one would expect to see it at, you're engaging with a new audience. So these are not people who anticipated that you would be learning about maritime heritage, but they're people there who are drawn by what you're showing, by the beautiful pictures, by the enthusiasm of the people presenting, and by the artifacts that you have to show, or by the activities that you offer. Handling collections, this comes back to being able to touch, to feel, to make connections in that way. And another one of my favorites, mobile museums. So these are converted vehicles that have a museum built inside them. You see one from the most famous one from the Maritime Archaeology Trust in the bottom there. These can be entire vehicles, or they can just be a trailer. But what they are is they're a self-contained museum space that can travel again to people, to be set up at different sites, in different locations that can be customized as well for the audience that you are working with. So if you were going to an event for small children, you have certain things. If you are going to an event for teenagers, you have certain things that you bring. And if you're going to an event for adults, again, different things. And then we move on to active engagement. So this is in many ways a museum engagement, the wider museum engagement that exists, because people have made the decision to go to the museum. But here we talk about talks, site visits, workshops, diver training, and yes, the community archaeology, where the community makes an effort to become involved in the work that you're doing. So I'm now going to talk very briefly about 2 case studies that I worked on. The first is going to be the Black Sea Map project that I spoke about before. And the second will be Changing Minds, Changing Coasts, which was a very unique project that I worked for when I was on Citizen. That was, in fact, the beautiful environment that I got to work in for 2 years, a fabulous place called Mersey Island off the coast of Essex. So what was the Black Sea Maritime Archaeology Program? So it was a multi-year, multi-million-pound project to explore how the Black Sea was formed. And what we were really interested in was to find out if it had been a very slow inundation, which had connected the Black Sea to the Bosphorus, or if it had been a very fast flooding event. And there were 3 arms of this project. There was the archaeological arm, led by Professor John Adams. There was an incredibly talented film team that made a documentary about our project. And there was the education team, for which I was lucky enough to be hired to be a part of. And as part of the education team, our original aims were to enhance science aspirations by highlighting a range of careers and applications of science to young people working, living in England. We wanted to increase the motivation in science learning. And a lot of the children that we ended up working with, when I say children, they were 16 years old. A lot of the teenagers we ended up working with came from backgrounds where their families had not gone to university. Their families came from sort of broken social situations. And they came from a financial background they felt precluded them from going to university. And so we wanted to increase their motivation in science learning, and we wanted to develop skills that they may not have been able to get in the same way as their peers, through their families, through extracurricular activities, so that they could end their high school and A-levels on par with their colleagues. So these were our original aims, but very quickly changed. We wanted to get kids on the boat. We wanted to get kids working with scientists. And we wanted to ensure that these disadvantaged children saw the potential in themselves. Many of them came with great concerns and with very low sense of well-being, because no one had seen the potential in them. And so we saw a golden opportunity to be able to change these lives. So the top photo is, I'm delighted to say, 4 of our students on the boat. And the bottom photo is just to show you the size and the scale of the research vessels that we were working on. So what kind of training did we do with them? We had 32 students that we worked with over 2 years. We had 16 of them have onboard placements, and 16 of them have onshore placements. So we took 16 students with us to Bulgaria in groups of 4. And then we had 16 students that worked primarily with scientists at the National Oceanographic Centre in Southampton. And importantly, we wanted to make sure that they got something out of this in the end. So they were working towards a nationally recognized Gold Crest Award, which, although it didn't give them points to go to university, it was something that showed a huge level of commitment and a huge level of independent research. We ran a 1-week training session for them, where we started with the basics. what is archaeology? And then moved on to looking at ideas like coring, working with mini remote operated vehicles, filmmaking, surveying, trips on small survey ship, the history of Bulgaria, and much more. And then we moved to the onboard projects, where students did coring and science communication projects, and then onshore projects, which were more GIS-based, but also with some science communication. And the outcome was very happy students. And what I'm delighted to say is that of the 32 students that we worked with, 31 went to university, and 31 have now graduated from university as well. Only one archaeologist, but several doctors, several scientists, nurses, a couple of teachers, a wide range of professional skills that they didn't believe they had the capacity to do. And when thinking about this, we also did some wider public dissemination. So we made 3 educational films and resources for teachers, parents, and after-school clubs. One of those focused on science, another on careers, and another on gathering information from films. And all of these were promoted, and the project itself was promoted by a big poster mail-out. So we sent one of these to every school in the UK, for them to put up on their walls. And then we thought, we've had so much fun, we've had so much impact, let's take our show on the road. And we developed the Black Sea Map Roadshow. So this was working with the University of Southampton, and it allowed us to go to these festivals, science festivals, music festivals, and other events around the UK to spread the word of our fabulous project. Now, in developing the roadshow, what we had to think about was what assets did we have? What could we use? Now, many of the shipwrecks that we looked at on the Black Sea Map project were 2 kilometers below the surface of the sea, just obviously far too deep for us to dive down to. And so we used our remote operated vehicles to take and create incredibly good 3-dimensional 3D photomosaic models of the shipwrecks that we found. And in the second year, I was on board with a 3D printer as well. So as the ships were found, as the photogrammetric models were made, I would 3D print one of these. So we had all of this data. We had all 42 shipwrecks that we found, the data for these models, and we had the physical models themselves. So we thought, we'll make use of this. So what we did is we created a modular public engagement show, or a road show event. So the big photo, I can do this, big photo right here, is us in our full glory. We had the videos, we had the 3D printers, we had posters, and we had some activities that I will talk about in a minute. But we could also have just one component of it, or maybe 2. So here we had the models and the 3D printer. And that allowed us to go into very small events and very large events, and also to tailor what we brought to the audience that we thought was going to be there. So we had 2 main activities besides the 3D printer, which was always whirring away, making a little model for people to look at, and the videos. We had a hands-on coring table. So as you saw, we were taking deep sea cores, and what we decided to do was to replicate those with the different sediments and the different inclusions that we found, so that we could tell the story of the changes in the Black Sea from the beginning to the end, and allow children of all ages, as I discovered, to get their hands in and to really feel. So again, we're talking about textural things. We're talking about the ability for people to touch. And as they went through, we would have one of the people facilitating tell the story. So, you know, here you are in prehistory, here you are moving to the Romans, here you are moving to the Ottomans, here you are moving to our modern seabed. And we also turned our 3D models into virtual reality. So we started off just having the models. People put on the headset and they'd be standing on one of our shipwrecks and could look around. But gradually my colleagues, Felix Pedrotti and Dr. Michael Grant and various other people have developed this to be a standalone movie. So again, you put on the VR headset, but instead of just looking around, you have this wonderful audio narration. You have a 5-minute video, which is just long enough for people to get a hint of everything that we've done. And this again helps to contextualize what people are looking at. And then finally, when we thought about the end, we had to think of what we were going to do with all of our material that we had. So it was used a lot for promoting the documentary. So there's Professor John Adams holding one of the 3D printed shipwrecks. Again, a physical thing he was able to show people. And the larger photo there is myself and my colleague Georgia. And you'll note the script is not in English. So we were actually able to rebrand our entire roadshow into Bulgarian. And the legacy of it is that we donated it to a children's museum. They had it up, and they had about 40,000 people come and see it in the 1 month that it was there. And then they used it and brought it around to different schools and different small communities, so that in the end, I think they thought something like 350,000 people had seen our engagement activities. So that's a real legacy, but a real way of thinking about how, if you don't have something, you don't have an artifact, what can you do with it? On the complete other side of it, we have Changing Minds, Changing Coasts. This was funded by a COVID-19 public engagement grant through the National Environment Research Council. So, like many other people, I delightfully took a new job in January 2020. Working on a community archaeology program. I was supposed to go out and work with some local people to help record the coastal heritage that they were finding. And of course that very quickly came to an end. And we had to stay home. And so what we decided to do was develop and pilot a methodology for a community-led study on coastal change on the site we were working on Mersey Island. So we picked two very different parts of the island. We had Monkey Beach, which is the top photo, and Cudmore Grove, which was the bottom photo. And so we obviously had some initial questions. And initial questions we had to answer. How could we safely gather data? And what could we possibly use the data for? So we were unable to visit our sites. This was one of the prerequisites of the project, is that it had to be able to be delivered without us visiting in any way. And so we decided to look at 3 different data sets, to look at historic images and postcards, to record memories and oral histories, and to look at historic maps and see if we could put the 3 together to make a community-generated and a community-focused view on how things had changed. We decided on 6 indicators of change: the archaeology, which we knew very well, the cultural uses of the site, the biodiversity of the site, the salt marsh lost. So Mersey Island was ringed by salt marsh, which had protected it from erosion. But that had all but vanished in the last 100 years. Mud, because the salt marsh had been replaced by muddy plains, and of course high water lines. And so what did we get? Delightfully, we were gifted over 300 images from 55 collections And we recorded 6 hours of oral history from 9 individuals. So now we had 100 years of history, and we wanted to understand how the change had happened. And so what we decided to do was to use 2 images per 20-year interval period, and to try and contextualize, to try and look at what had changed. We discovered it was very difficult to date the postcards. It was very difficult to find the dates of the photographs, and so we started looking at buildings and other infrastructures, and started looking really at historic clothing as well, and the vehicles that we had, to see if we could date the photographs and the postcards in that way. And we also thought about the oral histories, and thought about whether or not this was memory and the concept of memory. Is it nostalgia? Is it truth? If you talk to 2 people, they will remember things very differently. And so essentially what we had was we had 2 very imperfect data sets. We had the memories people had of the past. We had the photographs that sometimes told us something completely different, but maybe they were right if they were in a different place in our timeline. And this is where our community came in. So we developed a reiterative process to analyze the images. And we used social media and local social sites and designed quizzes that we put out to the wider public. So once we had picked the images that we had, we asked them if they had a general idea of when the photos were taken, and we asked them specific questions that we had. So in this example, we are particularly interested in the flooded creeks. Do you have any comments on them and how they have changed? And these images really acted as an aide-memoire to draw out targeted memories. So in this delightful example, somebody said, I know exactly when that photo dates from, because my father built the railing. So it must clearly be after this point, which allowed us to more contextually place it into our timelines. And this also ensured that the local narratives could be included in the interpretations that we had. So our volunteers, finally able to get out, helped us by providing before and after photos, where we had, and really could see, the huge amount of change that had happened in the coasts at this time. And really, what drew all of this together was the maps, was looking at the historic maps. So from these, we were able to create view sheds using the images for each interval, and then we would tack on the oral history markers as well within that. And that allowed us to draw out a really interesting history of how things had changed on the island and what some of the contributing factors might have been. And what we found was that the natural events, such as great freezes, and human-driven events, such as pollution from agriculture, created a loss of eelgrass. Eelgrass had been what was protecting the salt marsh. Once the eelgrass died, the salt marsh eroded away, and that meant more coastal archaeology. So we had the answer to our question of why, in the last 10 or 15 years, this small island had become a hotspot for coastal archaeology in the region. And what were the outcomes? Well, we had 2 tangible, really, outcomes. We had a display in the local museum, and we also had an online story map that we made where you could really combine the oral history and the photos and the view sheds together. But most important outcome for me was actually the increase in well-being that had happened over the pandemic with the people that we had worked with. So as they say here, the NERC project has been a lifeline during the incarceration and lockdown, and NERC has awakened old memories and sharpened awareness of the huge changes that have taken place within living memory. We also published an article in Current Archaeology, and our reports were made freely available online in an interim paper. So you'll all be delighted to know we have reached the end of our time together, but to sum up, these are a few things I want you to take away. So maritime cultural heritage is not just submerged archaeology. It is tangible and intangible heritage of everything relating to our connections to the sea throughout history. There are many ways to engage with maritime heritage, and it is important for us to recognize as archaeologists that we need to provide different ways of engagement, both passive and active, to encourage people to join the heritage cycle. How people engage can and will change over time, depending on their engagement experiences. And engagement does not have to be high-tech or expensive to be effective. You must pick the right way for your aims and the audience that you are working with. So the Black Sea Map project was a multi-million-pound project. Changing Minds, Changing Coasts, it cost us about £400 to do all together. And they both had a great impact on both how we saw heritage, how we as archaeologists saw the heritage around us, and also on the people that we engaged with. So thank you very much for your time today, and if you have any questions, I would be delighted. Oof, he goes.
This is amazing. This is very, very much of an eye-opener, actually. I mean, probably one of the most interesting presentations I've attended recently. 22 years ago, 23 years ago maybe, was my first visit to the British Museum in London. And as I went there, in one of the halls there was a big sign that says hands-on, with two hands like this. And I didn't know what hands-on is. I had no clue what this is. So I went there, and there was a mother and a girl, little girl. And one of the museum staff was sitting there with a box, and the box had artifacts in it. And he was handing the artifacts to the little child. And she was just holding them, smelling them, trying to listen to them, this sort of thing. And for me, this was like, from outer space. I couldn't believe that this is done in a museum. I came from a totally different background, totally different culture. But when I went and asked the guy, what the hell is going on? I mean, how can you handle this little child a piece of original artifact? What if she drops it to the floor and broke it? She said, well, if it's broken, it's broken. We have, I think it was an oil lamp maybe or something, or a coin, a coin probably. He said we have several thousands of them in the storerooms, and I mean, nothing is going to happen if a child breaks it, it breaks it. But this is how they learn. And I think this moment switched something on, and I said, well, this is something that we had no clue about. And apparently, this is what is this all about? I mean, how you can get people engaged. The Changing Coast, Changing Mind project, it's mind-blowing. It's very interesting. I mean, I was thinking about Alexandria, basically, and how radically it changed during the past 50 years, for example. Very interesting, Danny. Really, really very interesting. And there's a lot of things that can be done now. I mean, in Egypt, in our region, there's a lot of things that we can apply to try to engage people. People often think that archaeology is, for those guys, for those Zay Hawass guys, but not for everyone to be involved in. So thank you very much for this. And please, if you have any questions for Danny.
No, it was my absolute pleasure, and I think part of the reason why I really wanted to include the Changing Minds, Changing Coast project is I wanted you to see there are ways of working with community that do not involve them excavating. And there are ways to involve the local perspective that doesn't need to compromise the archaeological integrity of the work that you're doing, and that their perspectives can add so much. And they really helped us interpret the data that we had. Without them, without their memories of these places, without their local knowledge of how things had changed, it would have been exceptionally difficult for us to tease out from the postcards and from the oral histories as well what was truth, what was fiction, and what the timeline was for these sorts of projects. And again, like you said, I loved your story about visiting the British Museum, because we still have these problems sometimes. And I'm sure anybody here who's worked in a museum, in a educational setting in a museum, knows that you'll go to a curator and you'll say, please, can I have something for the children? And they go, no, they'll break it. And you go, well, you have 20,000 of these roof tiles. Can I have one? Are you planning to rebuild? No, can I have one? But I think it's important for all of us to realize, to think about the trade-offs that we have with the artifacts that we work with, and that sometimes it might be better to take the risk. You know, it might be better to take the risk that something might break in the hands of a child if it means that 1,000 children will make a connection to heritage. It's a better trade-off than it sitting in a box, in a cupboard to never be seen again.
Of course. Thank you. Questions, comments in Arabic if you wish. مفيش مشكلة. اللي عايز يسأل بالعربي يسأل بالإنجليزي يسأل بأي حاجة. Go ahead. تفضل.
You said that maritime culture.
خليك مرتاح اقعد. خليك مرتاح.
You said that maritime culture heritage helped us a lot. How is that?
In so many ways. So, are you talking about as a society, as an individual? Because
Society and public peoples, not archaeologists, because archaeologists can go to these sites and see it for themselves, but public people or society won't see these sites.
No, but the idea is that if people are able to connect with them, then and engage with them, then there is the idea that the simple act of connecting and of being able to place yourself within a wider society, to be able to place yourself at a point in time between the past and the future, that evokes many emotions, and it increases the benefits that a person has. So it improves their well-being. It improves the satisfaction and the happiness that the person can have.
If people
قول ما تتزنقش. قول بأي حاجة وأنا هتصرف.
So much better than my Arabic. So please.
قول.
Yeah.
If we want people to see these artifacts and to engage with it, how is that? Because as far as I know, to let people see underwater artifacts is expensive, and sometimes it's hard because some shipwrecks, some artifacts, if they come out of the water, it would be compromised or destroyed.
So, as always, we recommend the preservation in situ of the sites, so that they will remain underwater, and we do not raise the artifacts, because if they're underwater, if they're safe, if they're in a stable environment, then that is the best for these sites. But in those cases, we can use technology for people to have access. So we can create the 3D models. We can print things for people to look at. We can use photographs. We can use video. We can use audio. We can talk to people who maybe knew the craft or who've dived on it. There are many different ways that we can bring an underwater site to the surface for people while still leaving it there. But also, if we do bring the artifacts up and they are conserved, then again we can still use them to show to people.
So do you mean that photographs and 3D models are as effective as seeing it on real life?
That is a very good question, because I don't think anything can replace, for some audiences, the actual feeling of seeing and touching and going to a site. Because again, we're talking about the out of sight, out of mind idea. So if you cannot see the heritage itself, then you're less likely to believe it's real.
Yeah.
So always it's important to have the different ways, the different senses and the different ways people can connect. So and sometimes it is difficult. So with the Black Sea Map project, we obviously had no artifacts. We had nothing at all. But we decided that we could 3D print the shipwrecks. So then there was a physical thing that people could hold and people could look at. So we had something, and then we made the table so that people could feel. And although it wasn't the real thing, it was still in their minds a physical connection that had been made.
Thank you.
No problem.
I mean, you have to work with what you have. يعني لو انت تقدر الناس تشوف الاوبجكت شخصيا هتشوفه. ما تقدرش، لازم تتحايل على القصه دي. لازم تلاقي وسيله غير ان انت تعزل الناس عن الموقع، ان الناس ما تعرفش الموقع او ما تشوفش الموقع. تشوفه بقى هو شخصيا، تشوفه فيرتشوالي، تشوفه بالموديل، تشوفه بصوره، بخريطه. دي مسؤوليتك انت. اتفضل.
كنت حاسس ان مثلا ان لو الناس شافت الحاجه
شخص
برضه ممكن في ناس ما بتصدقش الكلام ده، هيقولوا الشخص ده هو اللي صنع الموديل.
يعني ما هو انت لازم تشتغل باللي في ايدك، باللي متاح معاك. ايه الوسيله اللي انت تعرف بيها الناس على الشيء ده، على الموقع او على المكان او على القصه. كمان what Daniel said about stories, about telling the story. It's not just about the artifact or the object. هي القصة مش قصة القطعة، قصة الحدوتة اللي ورا القطعة. ليه وازاي وفين وامتى وهنا ليه وغرقت امتى ولا اتلقت فين ولا مين اللي لقاها ولما لقاها كان حاسس بايه. يعني في متحف مشهور جدا في بريطانيا مسجلين صوت للمكتشفين بتوع الموقع لما اكتشفوا الموقع. صوتهم هم بيتكلموا مع بعض. الكلام ده تم في الثمانينات، يعني الموقع ده اكتشفوه في الثمانينات. I'm talking about the voice recording in the Mary Rose Museum of the divers, just talking to each other. ده ملوش علاقة بالآثار خالص. دول الناس بيتكلموا لما لقوا القطعة الأثرية من 50 سنة. لكن ده في حد ذاته very attractive. انك تسمع اتنين بيقول له يا بص احنا لقينا ايه، يا نهار ابيض، تكلم الموقع قول لهم احنا لقينا مش عارف ايه. بالشكل ده موضوع جذاب جدا وفيري اكسايتنج، رغم انه ملوش اي علاقه بالاثر نفسه. الاثر نفسه مش ما حدش شافه بعد كده. فيعني لازم تتعامل باللي انت متاح لك. يعني ليشا.
Hi. Okay, I got a hard-hitting question for you.
Go on.
While we are all lovers of cultural heritage, the lack of employment in the field of cultural heritage is prohibitive towards people who do not come from wealthy or supportive families or are well-connected. What advice can you give to students considering a career in cultural heritage management who are realistically hesitant to pursue studies which often cannot financially sustain a future or offer many employment opportunities?
Well, Alicia, thank you very much for your
I've had the
for
question
your
myself, so I figured I'd ask you
no,
too.
it's a good question. So my background, I came from a very non-affluent farming family in the middle of Canada. And I did not receive funding for my master's, and I did not receive funding for my PhD. So I worked through the entire process of getting those degrees. And I've taken jobs that have nothing to do with heritage, as I'm sure that everybody working in heritage has done at one time or another. And so what I would say is aim small and dream big. If there's one thing I could take home is that not everyone's first project will be working on something like the Black Sea Map project, but everybody has the capacity and the ability to make a small-scale change in maritime cultural heritage and how it's perceived. And there is no harm in doing something for fun as well. There is no harm in getting through a degree and realizing that actually you have to take a different job outside of the sector, and that maritime archaeology becomes the thing that you do as an avocational person. It becomes the project that you go to every year to help the local archaeologists. And I say this because I know there are not enough jobs. And I know that there's not enough well-paying jobs out there. And it is not easy to become a maritime archaeologist. It's not easy to work in heritage in any way, shape, or form. But I think if it's important to you, then I think it's important to try and find a way of keeping it in your life, even if it can't be professionally, and it has to be as a passion. Does that answer your question? Kind of.
I just had the question asked to me by somebody else, so I figured I'd ask you as well to get your opinion on the matter. Thank you for your response.
Yeah, no problem.
تفضل. ايه. لا أول
First of all, thank you for the lecture. I liked it. Naturally, if you have small children and you go to any beach, you'll find the children naturally goes toward the water because they know genetically that they are coming from water, from the womb of the woman, and so on. So we have this attraction of the sea. But you have been talking about the intangible heritage. Mm-hmm. Some of it is passive, mm-hmm. because we were talking about 7 seas and 7 skies, mm-hmm. and even the Atlantic Ocean. If you go to etymology, and the name of it is from Atlas, and they call it the Sea of the Darkness, mm-hmm. this fear, and even in Arabic, Bahr al-Zulumat, they said and some people, in history there have been some empires. The Romans called it Mare Nostrum, our sea. Mm-hmm. Even the Greeks, Thalassamas, our sea. And then the Muslims called it Safid. This is why we call it in Arabic al-Bahr al-Abyad al-Mutawassit. I don't know from where it came white, but it is Safid from Turkish and Persian heritage. Something else, do you consider Mediterranean Sea? Is it a bridge or like Berlin Wall between north and south? Now it's a symmetry. And even in the modern time after the Second World War, they called it vacuum. It must be employed by some power. So I don't know, it's not a position of some part of the world. It's terminology about some closed, it's lake, but they call it sea. I don't know, Caspian Sea or Black Sea. It has no outlet, but they call it.
It does, yes.
The Black Sea is connected.
Through the Bosphorus. The Black Sea is connected through the Bosphorus to the Mediterranean. Bosphorus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very small. It's like the Mediterranean Sea. Mediterranean Sea, it's Gibraltar.
Yeah.
It's very small.
No, but the connection between the Black Sea and the Bosphorus is.
Yes.
I mean, the Black Sea was created from.
How about Caspian Sea? It's closed, I think.
The
Caspian Sea.
No, it is. It's not. It's not closed. It's not a lake. It is connected.
For me, when I see it,
it's connected.
Last thing, they call the Mediterranean the biggest toilet in the whole world, because everyone toilet, bathroom. They just reject anything from Europe. It will be astonishing for you if you know that Spain, Turkey, and Greece, they are importing fish from North Coast, from us, because it's not polluted. The fish was our fish. I don't want to take more time to talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your comments.
Any more? Okay. Farah? Okay. Farah?
Hi. Okay, so you talked a bit about the oral history. Okay.
Please?
Oral history.
Oral history.
Okay, so let's say I'm documenting a specific area, and like how far can I go depending from an academic point of view? How far can I go depending on oral history as a source or as a credible source?
How far you can rely on oral history
Yes.
as a source of information?
So with oral histories, as we saw in our
Like
project,
the stories of the locals, and if there isn't like credible sources, that documents to support it. So
with oral histories, it's always important to use it as one of the many sources that you use. So I would never advise that somebody does oral histories and accepts that as the only methodology and the only source that they have. And so what you really need is the oral histories need to work in partnership with the archaeology. So they need to inform each other. And especially as we found, we needed all three. We needed the oral histories, we needed the photographs, and we needed the maps. And together, that allowed us to go back and work with the community to contextualize all of it together. It's the same as when we do archaeology. We don't just dig. We then do science afterwards. We use different methodologies in order to understand what we're looking at. So with the oral histories, I think you always have to remember that it's memory.
It's like cross-referencing,
Yeah,
you know?
exactly. Yeah. So it's one thing. It's one thing you can use, but it should never be the only thing that you use.
okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
especially that sea people generally
Yeah.
tend to exaggerate a lot.
Oh, they
I mean,
lie.
if you talk to a fisherman about, the biggest fish he caught, you will find, enormous
Jaws.
dimensions.
Jaws,
yeah.
yes.
So it's always like this. And also misunderstanding by the locals. They might see something and they think it's something and it's something totally different. Yeah, I mean, it happens all the time that according to their own knowledge, they have specific interpretation to something while it is totally different from your point
it has
of
to
view.
be supported with actual.
Yes, absolutely. It has to.
Okay, thank you.
Think of it this way. Think of the archaeology is how can I describe this best? The archaeology is the ice cream, and the oral history is the sauce that makes it so good. It adds the color, it adds the texture, it adds something really special to it. So you have the facts, and then you have the local knowledge, the oral history on top of it, and that adds the color, that adds the specialness to it. To make it attractive, but also to make it better. It makes it better because then instead of it being the archaeologists who have come in and said this is the way it was, you have a local voice involved saying yes, it was the way it was, and you can connect the two together. So you can have the local saying, the winter of 1963, it was very cold, it froze, everything froze up, it caused a lot of death of the local plants along the coastline. We lost we lost some bridges, we lost some things like that, and then you go to the archaeological record, and yeah, there it is. But their stories make it important to the local people. It's their voices. It's not just your voice. It's our voice then.
Any more? Well, I have one question for you, basically. Most of archaeological excavations and research in our regions are done by foreign missions, if I may say. Not just in Egypt, but worldwide. I mean, Egypt has 300 archaeological missions working on. And this is totally okay, and it's totally accepted because the knowledge of excavating a site or surveying the site is the same. So it can be done by anyone. But when it comes to public engagement, could this still be done by foreigners, or does it have to be done by the locals?
It would not be as rich and would not be as wonderful if it was done by foreign individuals, because, as I said, it's about not just creating a the way we create connections is not just with things but with people. So it would be much better if you're going to an Egyptian school to have an Egyptian person talking about the heritage, because then it becomes easier for people to think of it as their story, because then it's not somebody from the outside coming in and saying this is your past. It's a member of your own community saying this is our past, and that.
So it's the able to link with it better.
Yes, exactly. Because as I said, it's all about people. It's not really about things. It's about connecting with people through things. And people in the now and people in the past.
Yeah,
those are the interesting stories.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, تفضل.
I have personally attended many conferences about the
Blue economy. Okay.
Right, very good, because we have lack of sources and so on. But this is not a menace to archaeology and people, like what happened on Earth. You are talking about tangible and intangible heritage, but they have done this. They don't care about archaeology. This means ruins and traces of the past on Earth. I think it will be dangerous for you. They want fish and want to eat.
No. This is, if I may reply, this is not exactly true, because underwater culture heritage is internationally, according to the United Nations, is considered part of the resources, ocean resources. So even if you are exploiting minerals or oil and gas or fishing, underwater culture heritage is part of this, because it has an economic impact. Entire societies can build their economy around underwater culture heritage and tourism and sustainable tourism. So this is definitely considered. And this is basically what we are doing in the HFF Policy Forum in April. We are putting all these people together to discuss, the link between underwater culture heritage and oil and gas and fishing and the military and education and ocean and ecosystems and so on. So it's definitely integrated in this, definitely. This is something totally different. Anyway, our region doesn't really have this problem as much as other countries, Far East or Latin America, but our region doesn't not really have this issue. Okay, thank you very much for your attendance, and Daniel, thank you very much for coming and for this magnificent presentation.
It's been my absolute pleasure, and if there are any more questions, please do come and ask me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.